warm welcome. I'm Sutapa Banerjee, and a warm welcome to all those who've logged in for this panel discussion. The topic reads, can businesses be environmentally conscious? I have an illustrious panel, and I'm privileged to chair this discussion. We will have Medha Patkar who will join us in a bit. We have Mihir Sharma, who's the senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, who's already there on screen. Shankar Venkateshwaran will also join us shortly. He was the chief of the Tata Sustainability Group. What I've done is basically just done a one-line introduction to these people, because as they speak, they will weave in their experiences, and that I thought was a much better idea than reading through their long bios. I will draw from my own experience when I speak. But what I'll start by doing is just lay some of the contours. I will leave it open because we have people who come in from diverse areas and hence will bring in diverse perspectives. And this is a problem which requires multiplicity of perspectives. So even when I lay the contours, you can interpret this your way and actually talk about it. So to me, can businesses be environmentally conscious is a little bit of a rhetorical question. The more pertinent question to me is, how can businesses be made to be environmentally conscious? Because I don't think much of an option exists there. So, what I will talk about at the outset will be on the how. What could be some of the ways of making businesses behave in a manner which is environmentally conscious, whether they have or they haven't. And I'll draw upon examples as I speak. I myself come from the financial services part of the world. While it says Harvard University against my name, I am not an academic. I am very much from the corporate and business world. In fact, from the very ruthlessly profit-driven financial services world. So that's where I led largest part of my career. I have my tentacles also in academia because I left and I did a fellowship at Harvard, post which I taught as a visiting faculty at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. I also do workshops. I sit on the boards of a number of companies as an independent director. So I see how sustainability, etc., gets handled at the board levels as well. And I've also spent time in the social sector as a board member of Oxfam, apart from working also on consulting assignments with the Seva Group. So that kind of, has my tentacles in multiple areas, and I will draw on that as I speak. So, as I said, to me, the more important question is, how can businesses be made environmentally conscious? How can they be made to behave in a way which is, their role is not really to solve the environmental problem, but they are part of the players which are engaging to responsibly work towards a solution together. And they don't operate in a vacuum. They operate in an environment, and the environment comprises multiple stakeholders. It comprises investors, consumers, employees, the community, and the government, right? And the pulls and pressures that are exerted by the stakeholders will actually nudge and move business in a particular direction. And to me, those pulls and pressures are what is important. And those pulls and pressures necessarily, if we were to have a toolbox for ushering in any change, in my mind, comprise a few things: education, legislation, incentives, and behavioral nudges. So those to me are, and you can work through all of them or some of them, or a judicious mix in different contexts at different points of time, depending on the sector, depending on who you're addressing. So it's then important to actually look at so that's one part. So basically, what tools should we use? What have we used? What have we done well, if at all we've done anything well? And what can be learned from that and use in trying to address the problem, which is infinitely complex and nuanced, and which is why we all feel that we're still lurching headlong into a crisis. So one of the things that I wanted to lay out is the fact that in the Paris Agreement, what's come to be known as NDCs, or the nationally determined contributions, which is reduction of emission, increasing the amount of electricity used so we don't use fossil fuels, and creating a carbon sink. Now, I'm not getting into the exact percentages there. these are sizable and they need to be reached by 2030. But the point I want to make here is it has been estimated by Niti Aayog that all of this will take about close to 2.5 trillion US dollars in terms of projects, the cost of projects towards either mitigation, climate mitigation and adaptation. The India GDP stands in 2020 at about 3 trillion US dollars. So the point that I'm making is simply public funding is not good enough. You need to have access to cheap and very large amount of funding, which needs to come from private sources as well. So that's the other part which I wanted to lay out. The other thing which I wanted to actually talk about is, while we talk about solar and wind power and electric vehicles, in other words, renewable energy, which needs to take center stage, we also, if we just scratch the surface a little bit, we need to understand that all of these have components which come from the not so clean world. For instance, you need copper, you need aluminium, you need lithium ion, right? Aluminium is almost as dirty as iron ore, as a mineral which needs to be mined and extracted to be able to make them. So what's happening is, if at one level the demand for renewable sources and greening goes up, and we actually clamp down, as the governments have done globally on the supply side, on all of these areas that I spoke of, what you have is the cost of raw materials going up, right? And which then makes greening that much more expensive. That doesn't mean it ought not to be clamped down, but the only reason I'm making the point is all of this is nuanced and complex, right? So it is about clamping down, but not enough to make it prohibitively expensive to do greening, because then you're kind of undercutting what you want to do. So that's the third point that I want to make. And the last point before I start to hand over to Mihir, and then, I will come back and I will interject, and as we, make it a conversation going forward, rather than only just one speaker speaking for large lengths of time, is the fact that, as I said, a business does not operate in a vacuum. It operates in an environment, and there are those tools that we use to nudge it to operate in the way that we would like it to operate. And there's a variety of ways in which greening or carbon emission reduction can happen. One part of that is obviously carbon taxes, fixing limits on carbon effluents that are coming out, carbon trading, some of which has been tried with varying degrees of success. Not everything has obviously been tried. And keeping all of that in mind, the whole area of and it's not just about pricing, it's also about simultaneously investing. It's also about investing in green, which to start with may require subsidies, as do all new sectors that one gets into, even much more so here. So then comes the whole question of, how can this be subsidized? How can it be supported? How can, government come in and give partial guarantees, and then in a judicious manner over a period of time withdraw and allow this industry to actually flourish, as has been the case globally for solar, including in India. So I want to leave that and then kind of move on to Mihir and come back on some of the points, but want to hear it from his perspective, because he comes, Mihir, you were a journalist, and you're a research fellow at this foundation. So please share your views, and then we will take it from there on to Shankar and Medha.
Thank you, Sutapa, and I think that was a very that was an excellent overview of the problems that we face when we address this question of how businesses need to respond to what is obviously a growing climate crisis. I think that we have to first snip away some of the more extreme points of view that might conceivably be associated with this subject. One way of looking at business and environmental consciousness, the issues of climate change and so on and so forth, is that they are necessarily the main instruments of climate change. At some point, almost all of us will have received maybe a Guardian article from a couple of years ago quoting a study that said 71% of global emissions or are caused by a particular 100 companies. And this is the kind of article that can get us pretty angry. But it also may be the wrong way to look at both climate change and the causes of climate change and how to deal with businesses' responsibilities in the field. The fact is that those 100 companies might be oil companies. They're very varied. They're oil, fossil fuels, shipping, airlines. We don't know. But they can also be privately held, publicly held, state-owned. They could be in heavily regulated countries. They could be in in completely unregulated jurisdictions. They're very varied. And it is also the case that, therefore, if you were to try and say that, can we somehow go after the top commercial emitters of carbon and use that as a quick way of addressing the climate change problem, doesn't really address it, because if those companies disappear, they'll be replaced by other companies. If we shut down all private fossil fuel companies or private coal miners, there's still state coal miners and so on to be dealt with. The problem with climate change is not really one of economic organization. It is one of how we organize production and consumption. So it's not about who's making the money and where it's being made directly. It is really more about how is it that we choose to live. And I think that's a fundamental problem that many of us are unwilling to tackle straight off. So, I mean, that's one extreme, which is to say that to assume that there is something about the nature of companies that is means that they are necessarily enemies of the battle against climate change is probably not the right way to look at it, though increasingly and worryingly common. The other way, the other extreme, I think, is one that you hear from a lot of people, including in the corporate sector, which is to say that companies are now necessarily allies. So you will hear many companies say, this is our sustainability project, this is these are our net zero targets, these are our zero emissions targets, these are the investments we're making in offsets, etc., etc. Now, on the one hand, it's wonderful to hear that's happening, because it shows that there is a change in mindset that is percolating through, including through multiple worlds, including the corporate world. But frankly, if we just look at the average press release from a company that is declaring its sustainability agenda and its commitments and its targets, and we say, okay, our job is done, which is probably what the PR people would want us to do, that's also not quite enough, because that's in fact in many ways as problematic a response as assuming that companies are necessarily enemies of climate change. Companies are not necessarily allies, companies are not necessarily enemies, right? The question is, as you had said a little earlier in the introduction, one of incentives, one of how is it that, one of regulation, how is it that we can try and ensure that by and large, most of the companies that are involved in environmentally exposed fields, whether it is mining, whether it is land use, or whether it is shipping, airlines, fossil fuel extraction, and of course in the power sector, which is obviously vital, whether we can ensure that the regulatory environment for these companies, the investor environment, and the other incentives that they face are appropriate for our own choices as a nation and as a world on a decarbonization trajectory. So first we have to sit and work out as communities, as countries, and eventually as a globe, how is it that we are imagining the trade-offs that we have to make in our own consumption and in our own expectations of future consumption in order to deal with climate change. Then within that macro notion of what the trade-offs are going to be and that broad decarbonization path we've set for ourselves, how is it that we can make companies our allies, right? It won't just come by setting a target on a global scale. We then have to then step back and say, okay, within this, how is it that I can ensure that the corporate sector has an incentive to work with me, to work with us towards meeting those decarbonization targets. And that's not a straightforward process. One of the ways, of course, in which we have to do it is regulation. But again, here there are reasonable debates to be had about how it is that we could possibly create the proper regulatory environment for companies that we know without strong regulation are not likely to be straightforward friends to a decarbonization effort. But I think that it is interesting to know that even in places that have not had a very good history with regulation, and I include India in this story, and maybe we can come to that later in the discussion. Even there, we are seeing slowly but surely a rush to the exits from a lot of environmentally unsustainable activity. And I think part of that is very simply that they have new incentives driven by who's paying for them, by their financiers. And it is, I think, unexpected. If 10 years ago you'd come to me and told me that, finance is going to be very difficult to arrange for a lot of environmentally unsustainable activities, I would have laughed in your face. But I think that that is increasingly the case. It's very hard. I don't think anyone, almost anywhere in the world, and almost definitely not in India, unless they can get financing from the state, you're not going to get private sector finance for example, a new coal power plant. It's very hard to get private sector finance for a new coal mine, right? You might get private sector finance to take over an existing coal mine, but nobody is going to be able to going to want to risk a new coal mine. There are ways in which the financial sector has just decided, I think, that a lot of extractive and environmentally unsustainable activities are also financially unsustainable for 20, 25 years. And I think that that's what happens when you go around and convince a large number of people that climate change is a real problem and it is going to impact our common futures. So nobody wants to take that risk in finance. And oddly, therefore, we are facing an interesting dilemma where some of our most polluting companies are no longer going to be able to be sustainable on their own. They're going to need to turn to the state for support, one way or the other. Either states for direct support, either state for for friendly regulatory environment, relaxing environmental regulations, or they're going to have to turn to the state directly for financing, saying you have finances, you have state-owned banks, you have other channels of financing, as well. You need to help us pay for our keeping our operations going. And I think that's a battle that is not being fought, therefore, in the corporate world. The future of whether the corporate world will be an ally or an enemy to environmental efforts going forward is one that is being fought in terms of state finance and state regulation. And I think we can come back to a couple of these issues in a bit, but those are my initial thoughts.
Okay. Warm welcome to you, Medha Patkar. Thank you for being able to join this panel. So I had kind of laid out the broad framework, and we had Mihir giving his perspective on this. So can we just now turn to you and share if you can share what you think about the topic, and if there are elements that we could later come back to, we will. But please feel free to take 10 minutes to tell us what you think.
Thank you, Sutapa. I'm sorry I could join a little later because of this not being techno-savvy. But the topic is very, very crucial. Today, when the farmers are agitating for last 10 full months and having faced martyrdom of 650 farmers, including farm laborers, it is very clear that the business by the corporates need to be really checked and challenged. And that is because unless they have faith in the principle of profit over people, no. Profit over nature? No. But nature and people over profit. Unless they have faith in this principle, they cannot really change the present practices, which are really resulting in an assault on the environment. And this need not be proved beyond limit, because everyone knows how the natural resources that the businesses use, that includes land, water, river, forest, minerals, how, and the air also, how that leads to not just depletion, not just over exploitation, but also destruction. And this is because there is no proper value framework that the businesses have yet developed and adopted voluntarily and willfully. And that framework can have the legal framework, but it has to be beyond legal or constitutional framework to human rights framework. And that right really of the humanity really can be protected as right to life and right to livelihood only if the environment, the natural resource matrix is protected. And when the businesses really go in for production using this capital, it is not just business environment, but business and environment. That relationship needs to be really checked. We know that when they want to really save and protect the environment, they must answer the questions which resource they will like to use as capital. And that depends on the type of business, but also the choice of technology. And if they are using even the forest, and at the cost of forest, they are producing something that is not acceptable in the present situation, when the pandemic has already taught us that we cannot survive without oxygen, and the green ventilators are the only sources. It is also necessary for them to answer whether they wouldn't mind using agricultural land for non-agricultural purposes. They should say no, or at least that should be the last resort. But that also is not followed by the businesses, and they choose based on their own criterion, closer to the market, closer to the transport facility, so on and so forth, closer to the water, etc. That needs to be changed. They must really say no to diversion of agricultural land, which is the source of food security. Also, how much land and how much water can they use? They must really put a limit, and this they cannot put it on themselves. I will come to the monitoring infrastructure and the institutional framework that needs to carry out this task of suggesting the limits, drawing the criteria and indicators, and then imposing those. But if the voluntary acceptance is there, it will not lead to imposition. It will be really bringing out that and making it acceptable. So how much of each resource can the businesses use? Now this also depends on the kind of business, as I said. If we have in mind the picture of industrialization as only related to the big businesses and not the small cottage industries or home industries, which was the Gandhian economic perspective, then certainly the much of land and much of water and everything will lead to the resource intensivity, and that needs to be controlled. And therefore the choice of business for any product, if you need a cloth, which kind of technology will you prefer? That will decide how much of natural resources will go into that textile business. But this criterion and this kind of choice is not made first by the planners, the state which is responsible to protect people and nature both, and then put it forth before businesses as a condition. Now these kinds of conditions also include where will the business be located. Now, if they have the thermal power project next to the river or even the seashore, then obviously the water to aquatic wealth, every resource will get affected. Now, that is not taken care of. While there are rules and regulations in India, the same notification environmental impact assessment is now being changed to a new one where this kinds of criterion will not be applicable, and the businesses then will not follow those controls and those criteria. So that is a must, that environmental ministry and environmental rules and regulations should be the real basis for monitoring businesses. But what happens is that the business people, the capitalists, are so powerful that they do not just get all concessions for the financial inputs, but also for the natural resource inputs, which are invaluable. And that is because they are politically and economically most influential. And that's why they need more and more loopholes. They need more and more concessions. Now that must not happen. And that will only be able to attain if the relationship between the politics and economics, politicians and businessmen, really gets changed. Now that this is high time that we really question this relationship, which is hands in gloves, which does not care about either the laws or the constitution, but rather they get the laws and regulations changed in their favor, neither in favor of nature nor in favor of workers. This is what is happening in India today. 29 labor related laws are being withdrawn and 4 weak codes are being imposed during the pandemic, during lockdown situation, which has not even given an opportunity for us to talk about occupational safety, to talk about the natural resource matrix that is being affected, and other impacts of business. So business ethics is the most important thing. The zero discharge condition is put forth in India by the pollution control boards. But when the pollution control boards have become politically controlled boards, how can one expect that in spite of there are the judgments coming out of Supreme Court, of the National Green Tribunals, those are not implemented? And the zero discharge about the effluents is not being followed. And we see in the state of Madhya Pradesh that the industrialists throw away their effluents straight into the rivers. You can't imagine how the rivers which comes in at a particular place in the Indore division of Madhya Pradesh with pure water goes out into another direction with black water, as black as your hair, Sutapa. So it is very, very unacceptable. And that river goes into another tributary and to the main river like Narmada. Now when this is happening, how come the Pollution Control Board, which is held responsible, the General Secretary of the Pollution Control Board is held personally responsible as per the Supreme Court of India's judgment of 2017, and yet that is not followed because there is no proper penalty clause in the environmental law, and even if there is in certain aspects, that is not implemented, and there is no deterrent action that is taken. Some kind of fine is not possible, acceptable, because the natural resources are invaluable. Without that, there will be no life, no livelihood. Leave aside, even if some products are to be discarded, like the plastic bags, plastic covers and packaging, we must do that, and the businesses who are sensitive to environment and environmentally conscious must really change their practices of not just packing, but overall use of resources. This resource intensivity leads to the minerals extraction beyond limits, a depletion of land and depletion of water and energy as well. Now coming to energy, therefore, we see that the cooling is now taking more a toll of energy than heating, and this all thing is happening because of climate change. Now that heat cum humidity index of climate change is something that is affecting the workers, but the environmentalists, the businessmen, we see inside the mills and industries do not take care of the artificially raised temperatures as well. We have textile mills in which our workers union is working, and they really sweat and give their blood to the operations of production. But they don't have the enough space to really raise issues, to ask for certain occupational safety measures. And now the code that is getting imposed instead of the full-fledged acts, that is going to stop the unions and the workers from demanding certain things which will control environment within industry and also outside industry. So the pollution of air and water, that really affects our. Another struggle is going on in Mumbai, where 5,500 project affected people were thrown in an area where they are pushed into the death and diseases. Now that is taken into consideration by the High Court and asked them to rehabilitate, and the government is saying we have no houses to rehabilitate. So should they keep facing death? Why don't they remove the industries from that area where the habitation has already taken place, to make it pollution free, the air as well as water? So certain of this kind of strict decision, although it is radical, also need to be taken, when they should not build in habitats near the industry where pollution is taking up one. And if that has already happened, then remove the industries and not just the people, if they have no capacity to rehabilitate them with the housing being ready. Rivers, water, land is already affected with the effluents, as I said. But if the forest is gone, then even the groundwater and the air is affected, and the forest is diverted to businesses. That needs to be checked and challenged. We know that the businesses certainly have some of them as somewhat sensitive towards the hazardous effluents or products, and they change their practices. They get into the renewable sources of energy instead of non-renewable. But even today in a country like India, when 60% of energy is coming from the coal, and that is something which is leading to the most of the carbon emission, and asked to be stopped by the international fora through the conventions and covenants. But when that is not bothered about by the businesses, who are the most resource exploiters, then how can you just believe that the summits, conventions and agreements, whether in Paris or Copenhagen, will really change the situation in India and the climate can be reversed back? That is not possible. So it is very essential that the businessmen get the orientation, but also get the checks and controls. And that is the duty of both the state and the society. And the society can only play this role by through the initiative taken by those who are affected. It is obvious that those who are directly affected will raise questions. Now those questions need to be taken seriously by the state, and at least have a dialogue with those who are in the struggles and movements. That also can lead to certain change in the policies, in the rules and regulations, in the laws, in favor of environment and people, and not just give maximizing of profit as concession to the businessmen. So I think first, change the course of business, change the types of business for any product that you need as the life support, whether it is clothing, whether it is food. Now the organic farming is a must. When the inorganic farming is promoted by the industries who are controlling seeds, fertilizers and pesticides, everything of that, and that is influencing the society. So society also must learn what are the natural resource protective practices in each of these sectors, whether it is farming or housing, how to build the houses with minimum exploitation of natural resources, which are being killed through the cement industry. So every sector we have alternatives, but we must have the faith in alternative development paradigm, and the society must also be educated and oriented towards this. but instead the consumerism, marketization, commodification, everything is being pushed into every sector. And that's why very small sections of society are raising questions, and they are not getting the due space in the polity and economy. So I think the society must play this role with the affected people at the forefront, but also the others who are sensitive, at least now when the viruses, cyclones, and every impact is being faced, that they must have simplicity, self-reliance, naturally sustainable and just kind of business practices as accepted, and not otherwise the else will have to be rejected. So I think that position must be taken very, very strongly, and international support is a must, because the global funds are flowing in. The financial institutions on one hand have golden principles and the best written manuals, but in fact their financing really changes the whole course of development and the development paradigm towards the capital intensive and natural resource intensive solutions to every demand of certain products. They do not care about people and nature. They care about profit and also the interest that they gain through their banking practices. So it is necessary that we challenge it, not just locally but also globally. I think this international panel and forum really can be one of the basis for spreading this kind of views of the people and people's movements, not really only to reach out to businesses, but also to the state and to the society. I think I should stop because you had given me 10 minutes. Sorry if I've taken longer time, but I can't hear you. Sutapa, you are muted. Can't hear you.
You can't hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, yes, now yes.
Yeah, yeah. So I said thank you very much for taking the time and for an impassioned plea. You work at the grassroots level, so your view and perspective comes directly from there. There are a few key elements that I have picked out, which I'd like to come back in greater detail, not just from you, but also from Mihir, and I'll share my own perspective also on that. One was, of course, you talked about the collusion and nexus, right? The nexus between economics and politics, which has been there in your view for a long time and which appears to continue, and which is what is leading to these extractive practices. That was one part that I picked up from you. And the other was about a lot of checks and balances, which, you know, when I started the session, I spoke about that it is not about whether businesses can be environmentally conscious, but what are the checks, pulls, pressures exerted by the environment that make them behave responsibly and in a manner that is environmentally conscious, right? So the environment has to push them in that direction, and that's where checks and balances come in. I spoke about education, but you elaborated on it, which is that if society or communities are to exert that pressure, they need to be educated and understand what is important, whether it's in the directly people living in those areas or in the urban areas. Anybody who exercises control or buys these kind of products. So education is one. We spoke about the government and we spoke about legislation and how that legislation needs to be balanced and needs to take care of the most marginalized and poorer sections. I do want to add that, you know, a farmer does not necessarily only mean marginal farmers. Farmers are rich and farmers can be poor, right? Just like industry, there can be micro enterprises and there can be large corporates, right? So those definitions by themselves don't mean anything, right? So a lot of the law, for instance, in the farmer law, where there's a lot of agitation, was for them to actually cut out the stubble burning, etc. Right? I'm not going to get into any detail because if we take any one problem, that itself, we can spend about 3, 4, 5 hours or days addressing that problem. But those are some of the areas I picked out, that it has to be a more inclusive, a far more inclusive society where all stakeholders are heard. Civil society organizations, communities, government obviously plays a role, the investor community, consumers, employees, all stakeholders. So that's one part. I want to come to a couple of things which you alluded to, Mihir, and was also spoken about in terms of resource intensivity and energy. So data suggests that about 2/3 of the burning of fossil fuels, which really is the main carbon generator, comes for two industries primarily, right? Energy and transportation. These are the two energy. And it is natural, just like the tobacco industry played that huge role in the US before giving up its hegemony. Similarly, there will be fossil fuel interests, and that needs to be fought. The interesting thing is, how do you fight that, right? There will always be some amount of vested interest, but the interesting thing to me always is, how do you fight that? Also, to me, the problem is a lot more nuanced. There are no villains and there are no good people. It is ultimately a nuanced, complex problem where everybody needs to come together to be able to try to find solutions. I will talk about, when I talk about energy, transportation, and fossil fuel and infrastructure, I will talk about we are today talking about all the time building infrastructure. Two key elements go into infrastructure: steel and cement. Both these are the most polluting industries, right? But we need steel and we need cement. Yes, there are substitutes for it, but we've not reached a stage where they can be substituted completely. How then do you make the manufacturing process less polluting? And that's, to me, an interesting question. And if you look at examples on this, for instance, in the area of ThyssenKrupp is, for instance, one company which is being pushed by actually big investors to stop burning coal. So burning coal is something which is used to be able to produce heat, which is important in the steel making process. And it's also something that actually takes away the oxygen from iron ore when you convert that into steel. So they are being pushed into, what can you do? How can you make this process? Can you do the process differently? And that's where technology and R&D really come in. And that's I use this example because this is one of the most polluting industries, but there is a lot of work happening there in terms of trying to green the process. And there are companies who are doing, well in that direction, and they need to be pushed in that direction further, because as I explained, it can't be done by public funding alone. You don't have an option but to involve business. You don't have an option but to involve all stakeholders in this very complex, nuanced problem of trying to find a solution or some solution to being climate friendly or towards moving into a more resilient setup. So, one of the things, for instance, and, I don't want to get into very great detail, but it is only when you put caps or when you say only so much of cement needs to be produced in this manner, the rest have to be produced. You need to be able to judiciously mix those four things between legislation and incentives and subsidies to be able to ensure, and with investors coming in, to be able to ensure that R&D actually picks up. I mean, today there is an effort to replace coal, through other technologies. In the making of cement, to have other kind of binders which will actually remove the most polluting part of that technology. So how do you make more of that is really what this conversation should move into. So that's one part which I want to leave, and it's interesting to see how solar, for instance, has actually taken root, not just globally but also in India, where we started. In fact, I actually looked at this data that even in 2010 for solar we were priced at something like 17 rupees a unit, and in 2019 it came down to 2.44 rupees per unit. And that happened with a number of things working, a number of stakeholders working in tandem, using subsidies, using incentives with the government, the state governments, and international funds, local companies, all contributing and making this piece happen. And it needs to be probably similar where it comes to any of the other technologies. For instance, I talked about replacing carbon with hydrogen in steel making. That has become a huge sort of area which is looked at as the newest emerging technology, with the Energy and Research Institute in India, TERI, saying that it is the emerging technology of the future. And I read recently that Reliance is getting into hydrogen fuel cells. It is a fact that you need large amounts of money and the business world to scale certain technologies. It is Toyota that's putting in money into this hydrogen cell technology. It is Reliance which is putting in. So, you can't divorce one from the other, even when you come to technologies. So that's just, some of the, a few points that I wanted to make. I wanted to talk a little bit more about technology and incentives. And here I shared my perspective here, Mihir's perspective first on that. Before Mihir, we got on to your other area, which you spoke about, which is the regulatory environment. But before that, I just wanted you to come in on, technology and the role that it needs to play now in the state that we are at, where, that 2%, which we all have heard of many times in terms of global warming, we've already crossed 1.2%. So we are at a stage where we need to do a lot of things with fairly great urgency. So what should some of these things be? How can that kind of technology be encouraged? How can R&D expenditure itself in India across sectors, particularly when it comes to polluting technologies that can reduce pollutants in the power, infra sector, etc., be given a fillip? Maybe you'd like to come in and talk about that.
Hi, thanks. Yes, so I think that's a very important point, because frankly, you mentioned one of the industries that you mentioned in your discussion just now was the cement industry, and we have known for at least 12 to 13 years that any serious decarbonization effort in India is going to need to take into account the fact that we have a relatively polluting cement industry. It's and pollution comes from two areas. It comes from the use of energy for heating, and then it comes in the production of the cement itself. And the issue here is that there are technological advances that can be used to reduce the level of emissions in areas such as cement, right? But you have to then sit down and ask yourself, for each of these industries, which is going to be the most efficient way to get them to shift technologies, right? And in cement, for example, the availability of the technology may not be that easy, right? You may need to ensure that the technology is made available to the Indian companies that could adopt it. Second, you need to make sure that the adaptation costs are not so high that they choose not to do it. Finally, they will need maybe a regulatory push in order to shift from whatever they've been working on with currently towards the new technology. And of course, they will need the financing to cover that shift. So each of these, the fact is that in many of the fields that we're looking at, whether it is cement, whether it is steel, these are traditionally sectors that we have considered relatively hard to make environmentally sustainable. In all these sectors, there have been technological developments over the past 7 to 10 years in particular that can, at least from an Indian perspective, bring us up to global standards in emissions, which is maybe the first in emissions and in pollution and in resource use, which at least may be the first step that we need to take. But in spite of efforts being made since 2009, these four elements have not been put together in a sectoral way. And each sector will need a different mix, right? And some sectors are more politically exposed, whether because they have a closer link to political decision makers, or because they have a larger workforce and therefore politicians are less likely to want to regulate them harshly. But either way, there are ways in which, for each sector, you need to be able to create a recipe of for the transition which uses this toolbox of four things, which is technological transfer, financial incentives, stricter regulation, and finally actual availability of finance for the technology. And once you can put these four together in as a recipe, as a menu available to every sector, you can probably imagine a situation in which a lot of sectors will begin this transition. But the fact is that no individual ministry in the government is going to have the desire to do this. Why would the cement, why would the steel ministry want to spend a large amount of its time and its effort on creating this fairly complex roadmap for companies, right? They're only the bureaucrats there and the politicians there in the steel ministry are only going to create this roadmap if they are told in advance that it is important, if they are pushed into doing it, and if their other efforts and other issues are deprioritized in comparison. So, it is a question, I think, of political will at the highest level in a lot of emerging economies to set aside the state capacity to create these roadmaps for decarbonization for every sector. Because unless you have sector-based roadmaps for decarbonization, which combine these four mechanisms, you are not going to be able to see a major change in how business operates, whether it is steel, whether it is cement, or any of the other major things that major sectors that we will need to get to make more environmentally sustainable. Sutapa, you're still muted, I'm afraid. Still muted. The mute's at the bottom. Well, yeah, you're unmuted.
Yeah,
Go.
I think. Yeah. I think it's being also
You're
controlled.
unmuted, but I still can't hear you. I think there's a problem at your computer's end.
No, my end is fine. I think even the unmuting happened by somebody else. Are you able to hear now?
Anyway, let me speak for a bit.
Okay.
For a bit more, in case people can hear me, because I don't think I can hear Sutapa. Right. So let me just follow this thought through while Sutapa tries to unmute herself.
There's nothing I can do. It's all from my end. It's unmuted. So if there's anybody listening in, can understand that's.
I think I'll want
to do something because I'm unmuted from my end.
A bit more. Sutapa, I still can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Okay, great.
I can hear you.
All right. So let me try talking for a bit. Maybe there are a couple of ways in which the Indian experience can be generalized to several other emerging economies. And I want to talk a little bit about issues maybe in countries that are particularly dependent upon resource extraction industries. And here we have to recognize that relying on regulation is not always a good idea, because it is not simply a question of the links between businessmen and politicians that we have to worry about, but it is also maybe in democratic societies, people can be genuinely worried about the costs for livelihoods of enforcing greater environmental regulations, right? There are countries that in South America that are relatively dependent upon resource extraction. There are places in South Africa. South Africa itself, the country, is going through something of a crisis and trying to exit its coal industry in a manner that ensures that people remain employed and in which livelihoods are not lost on a massive scale. And in parts of India, we have some similar problems in trying to ensure a just transition away from coal for individuals. So when we start thinking about the regulation of businesses, I think it is important to recognize that sometimes politicians take it easy for regulation, not just because they're concerned about their relationship with business, but also because they're concerned about maintaining the relationship with unions and with voters in areas that are dependent upon resource income. So we need a more macro perspective of this as well. Those of us who will benefit from a cleaner environment and from the eventual decarbonization process need to find ways to be able to compensate the people who are losing their livelihoods in areas that are dependent upon resource extraction, upon coal burning, etc. If we are to ensure that politicians take the right decisions about decarbonization going forward.
Yeah, so I'm still not sure because from my end it's unmuted. Am I audible? Am I audible now?
I can't hear you.
Because it says unmuted. Yeah, I'm able to hear you, but
I'm hoping that
still not able to hear
maybe
me.
other people can. Okay,
am
great.
I audible? Is there
We
somebody
can hear
else?
both of you, so maybe it's my end that's the problem. Go ahead, Sutapa.
Okay, all right. So, I completely agree with you about the ministry roadmap, because unless there is political will right at the top, I don't think any of these are going to see light of day. I'm still trying to figure if I'm audible because I heard some echo. Yeah, all right, okay. So that's an absolute given, and I don't think without that, as you rightly explained, with each of these ministries operating as silos, unless they're told or given the direction from the highest levels, we will not be able to get anywhere. And we do have a Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, which actually drove the solar power sector extremely well. And maybe that could be an example of how to go forward and do other things. It's extremely important to also look at globally, irrespective of other issues, how, for instance, in a huge country like China, I read that in a couple of years, it will no longer need to subsidize solar. Now, that's an very interesting and important lesson on any area which is new tech. I mean, there are subsidies, there are incentives that you need to give, and over a period of time, there is not just economies of scale, but there is learning curves that they use, and that learning becomes transformative and more efficient and makes the use of that particular technology far more efficient, which then leads to probably the third phase, where it then disrupts other businesses or other older technologies, and you tend to find this to be far cheaper, and there's no question of subsidies anymore. So that's how that whole piece works. And I actually wanted to bring an example of, for instance, electric cars, because we've seen even in India a number of companies coming out and making the call, not just electric cars, but electrified vehicles of all kinds, including from bikes to trucks to the works. And we've all seen that even today, the initial cost of an electric vehicle is high, but the maintenance cost falls, and even the fuel cost is actually much lower than what it would be for a non-electric vehicle. So, however, the pace at which the innovations and R&D is happening in the electric vehicle EV industry, it is even the actual cost of the vehicle. It is expected that in another 3, maybe 4 years, that cost itself will be equalized, and then it will fall, and which means basically that you've disrupted the older way of transportation completely. So that's the point I wanted to make on electric cars. And when we were speaking of solar, the other, which is wind, in a way it is almost counter-cyclical, right? I mean, during the day you have the sun, and typically wind speeds pick up at night. So in many ways, it is certainly a way in which you, as I said, if you require private funding, and the whole greening itself creates a huge commercial opportunity, it's about getting all stakeholders on the table and actually being able to judiciously play the game between incentives, subsidies, what form it should take, and using, in the final instance, a lot of behavioral nudges to actually, so you create the fact that you start ranking companies, creating, giving them kudos for what they're doing, so that each kind of competes with the other across multiple areas to be able to get better. It goes without saying that what you can do in the steel sector and what you would end up doing in a completely different sector would be very different. But at the end of the day, most of this, including raw materials, they work in a non-linear fashion. And you need to reach a certain stage before these forces start to play out by themselves. There could be other problems at that point of time, but that's really where it is. So to me, it comes from, one is the role that we've said that needs to be clearly played at the highest levels by the government, which also needs to have a very clear understanding of not just the science of climate change, but also, because it's not just education on that front, but it's also about how to encourage R&D and technology and prioritize that for the sectors which are the most polluting, and which was my reason for actually bringing up, steel, cement, etc. And yet, the point that I made right at the beginning, there is a kind of fine, nuanced balance that you need to achieve, because you need a lot of the old dirty economy, minerals and extraction to happen at a certain level, because they in turn actually help you create the infrastructure for wind power, electrical vehicles, etc. There are other things which are coming in, other kinds of technology, other elements which are coming in as well. But it's about balancing it out such that you give time for a completely new technology to take root, while you still use copper, while you still use aluminium to be able to get the solar panels and other things taking shape. So to me, it's a very nuanced kind of and a judicious play that needs to happen. But it does require a little bit of not just ministerially silos, but also silos which are very strongly there between the business world, the non-profit civil society world, government and academia. They all sit in separate silos, and very seldom do you see a complex problem being resolved by everybody sitting at the table to be able to resolve that in the manner in which it should. Easier said than done, but ultimately it will require everybody and all kinds of finances and approaches to be able to kind of tackle this problem. Is there any one or two aspects, Mihir, since I don't think Shankar, he messaged me, there was a confusion of timings. I don't think he's going to be able to join us. And I'm not sure Medha is still going to be around to talk about. So is there any other specific areas that you want to kind of pick up and talk about? Now you're muted. I can't hear you.
Hi. Yes. Thanks.
Yeah, that's it.
But I just want to I want to go back again to I think some of the things that have been thought of in terms of trying to make businesses more environmentally conscious. And one of the mechanisms that I think people hoped for was the corporate social responsibility mechanism. And India introduced, for those who are listening who are not from India, India introduced a law in the past decade, which said if you're a profit-making company, 2% of your profits have to be spent on projects that are related to corporate social responsibility. So let's say you're a large company that makes profits in the billions every year. 2% of that profit will be you have to administer or give to some kind, maybe a non-profit, maybe a trust that you've set up, but something that is working in predefined sectors that are related to that are considered socially responsible. So companies can sponsor hospitals, colleges, as well as some environmental projects like water supply projects and so on and so forth. I just want to highlight that this has not really turned out in the way that I think the framers of the law did, and I can talk about why it didn't. In effect, what's happened is that in this, a lot of companies have used it essentially as a form of political patronage. So, let's say you've upset some people in the neighborhood in which you operate because of unsustainable practices. You set up a trust focused on that neighborhood, and you maybe buy them off in some other way, right? There are, I mean, I have stories that I can tell you of mining companies in the south of India that essentially had business practices and extraction practices that were so problematic that several water sources in the area became unusable for drinking water. But they used 2%, the 2% mandated for corporate social responsibility to truck in bottled water for people in those areas. I mean, which is wasteful on multiple levels and clearly is not the kind of thing that this was meant for. But the reason that I think it did not work is because efforts to make companies more environmentally sustainable in their operations cannot be left to decision makers within the companies, and which is essentially what corporate social responsibility did. You have to be able to ensure that the incentives are being structured from outside, that the regulations and payoffs and penalties, if any, are being paid off, are being structured from outside. In the end, changing behavior can only be done, I believe, if there is somebody else or another location for power that matters. It is a question of power. Power and making the decision on how their money is being spent continues to be with company administration, as it was with India's corporate social responsibility law. Then you are not going to be able to see a shift in how they behave, right? They're just going to find other ways in which to behave the same way that they saw as being in their interest earlier. So it is a question of shifting around power, and that power can come from government regulation, that power can come from customers, that power can come from investors in the company, that power can come from their previous lenders, from the financial sector more broadly. But it is a question of finding power centers that can shift corporate behavior. I don't think, and I have to disagree with Medha Patkar, who spoke earlier on this subject, I don't think that we can expect a shift in behavior from the corporate world that is purely driven by a broader set of interests than the interests of the company. I think that if that happens, it's wonderful, but I don't think that we can count on it when we are faced with a crisis. So we have to have a much clearer sense of what the different power centers are that we can use to alter corporate behavior and the decisions of executives within the companies and the sectors that are crucial to climate change. And as I said, we don't have to think about using power purely in a blunt force, brute regulation kind of way, saying that, we will, just impose XYZ penalties on anyone who pollutes, because that can also lead to problems if they buy off the environmental regulators in one way or the other, as has been seen in India, as has been seen in many other economies like India's across the world. I think what we have seen is most effective is when they simply find that their operations become unaffordable in the longer run unless they make it more sustainable. If they combine that with the access to funds that allow them to transition to a more sustainable mechanism of operation, that allow them to transition to more environmentally conscious production functions, then I think you see a shift in the corporate sector. But until then, I don't think we're going to see anything. Thanks, Sutapa. I enjoyed this conversation.
Okay. So let me now, I think it's time to sort of quickly put a few points together and wrap that up. And I'm glad you brought out the CSR piece, which in many sense had become something as a kind of standalone piece by itself. you give 2% and different people did different things with that 2%. And it never really kind of got woven into business itself. So it remained the 2%. So to me, if I were to look at the regulation front, I think the business responsibility reporting, which brought in corporate disclosures about 5 years ago and started with the top 100 and then got extended to 500 and now has gotten more teeth in it. And I think there's a lot more that can be done to make this a really powerful tool. And CSR actually just gets subsumed within that, is a much better play, because ultimately sustainability is about conducting your business across the entire value chain in a manner that is responsible, which includes also the supply chain. So it's a much bigger and a more sort of comprehensive play than CSR, which just became a give out 2%. And anything that you introduce, unfortunately, is also can well be abused. So that's a part that I completely agree with. Just one part I would like to make, we've been talking about the part where we spoke about steel, where we spoke about cement, and R&D, is about how you sort of give incentives to make that, which forces the business to actually spend on R&D and actually innovate and try to come out with less polluting ways of either making the substance, or you actually substitute the substance itself. But the other part is the consumer, which means if I take, say, cement, it means that if the cement at the initial stages is priced higher, who buys it? I mean, do you have then the construction industry? So that's the other part. And that holds, I think, globally for anything which new technology produces, which to start with will always be a little bit more expensive. I mean, Medha, Patkar spoke about organic food. I mean, who can afford organic food, right? I mean, there is a pricing issue as well. And it needs to be bought for the production to actually happen. So there has to be policy measures which address that, which means you need to bootstrap the market such that customers will buy that. And once you're able to cross that hump, and then, it's, as I mentioned, the third stage where consumers are buying that, you've given a fillip to the production side, you've given a fillip to the consumption side, and then it kind of disrupts the more polluting technology in this instance, or what was being done, the age-old practices. So that's really that part. And coming back to, what Mihir, you spoke about, and it's, I guess, what I started with, that ultimately it is businesses do not, I mean, a business has been made with a certain purpose. Its sole purpose is not to solve society's problems, but it certainly is one among several actors, and a key one, which should be involved in the process of finding a solution to a problem. And in that, it does not operate in a vacuum. It operates in an environment with multiple stakeholders, all of whom need to exert pulls and pressures. In some contexts and in some sectors, some stakeholders play a larger role than another. In some, consumers may play a certain role in certain geographies for certain companies. And in some, the government and legislation may play a bigger role. In yet others, investors are starting to play a significant role. So it will be about all of these pulls and pressures, which will actually drive business to move in the direction that we want it to happen. So, I will end by, making the statement that I started with, that, it's not about can businesses really be environmentally conscious, but more about, getting all stakeholders together, and in a certain context, in a certain geography, in a certain sector, because this is all about, going granular and doing the right things at the right time, getting them all together, and then exerting the right pulls and pressures, which drives business into sustainability. And some will do it faster than others because they're in it for the long term, and some may not. And sort of re-emphasizing the role of investors, because there are today a lot of significant, large, long-term investors, including pension funds, which control trillions of dollars, which can play a really big impact or have a large impact on this particular sector. So I guess I'll end with that, unless there are any questions. I don't see a chat box, so if there are any questions, one can wait for that, or I think we will call this to a close. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks, Mihir. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for logging in. Thank you.